In this video, you're going to start to learn about Prisma. Prisma is the tool that we'll be focusing on in this section and in the next several sections. We're going to be using Prisma to connect our backend, Node.js, to the real database that we're going to be using. And Prisma works with a wide variety of databases, which we'll talk about a bit later. So the primary focus in this video is to figure out 1, what Prisma does, and 2, where it fits into our application architecture. Once we have a general idea of what Prisma is good for, we can actually move on to the next video and start exploring how we can set it up in our projects. To kick things off, I actually want to go through a visualization we've already been through before. It's one of the very first things we actually did in this class. If you remember, on the left-hand side, we had our clients. On the right-hand side, we had our server. In the middle, we started off with a REST API connecting the two, and later on, we swapped that out for a GraphQL API. We learned what GraphQL stands for, and we learned that it can work with any back end and any front end. Now, this is all indeed true. I did not tell you any lies, but I did leave out some of the truth. There's a bit more complexity to what happens on the back end than meets the eye. So what I want to do is go ahead and reduce the size of this visualization, making room for one more node over here. In reality, the server is just going to make up our back-end programming language. So for our purposes, that is any language. So once again, it could be Python, it could be Java, or in our case, the server is written in Node.js. Now, as a separate node, we have our database. And once again, this still can be any database we like. We could use MySQL, Postgres, or MongoDB. Any database can get the job done. The question, and what I want to focus on in this video, is how do we connect our backend Node.js with the database of choice? We need a tool to actually facilitate that communication. So when someone sends a mutation off to the server, instead of modifying one of the arrays like it currently does, needs to actually write to the database. When someone sends a query asking for data, the server needs to actually read from the database as opposed to just reading from one of our static arrays. So how exactly do we get that done? Well, we have a few options, one of them being Prisma. The first option we have is to use a native driver. So all popular databases like MySQL, MongoDB, or Postgres have native drivers for Node.js. These are essentially NPM libraries that make it really easy for us to connect our backend in Node to those databases. Now, native drivers are very bare bones implementations. We can perform all of the queries necessary to read and write data, but we do not get any nice to have features. We typically don't get things like migrations, data validation, and we don't get a way to actually map our models, setting up relationships between our data. So in the end of the day, if we were to go with a native driver, we would end up doing way more work than is really necessary. The next step up from the native driver is typically some sort of ORM. Now, ORM stands for Object Relational Mapping, and a couple of examples of these would be Sequelize or Mongoose. Sequelize is a great Node.js ORM for connecting Node to an SQL database like MySQL or Postgres. Mongoose is a great Node.js ORM for connecting Node.js to MongoDB. Now, when we start to get into ORM territory, we do start to get those nice-to-have features. We can actually model our data, things like users and posts, where a user has many posts. We can set up validation, saying that the password field needs to have at least 6 characters. And we can also migrate our data over time, adding and removing fields as our data structures change. All of these are possible with ORMs, and this is typically what we end up using. If you've taken my Node.js course, we used the Mongoose ORM in that class to connect Node.js to a MongoDB backend. Now, the tool that we're going to be using, Prisma, is indeed an ORM, so we still get all of those nice-to-have features. We can model our data, setting up things like users and posts. We can describe the relationships between our data. We can set up migrations for the data. We can perform validation. We can do anything one of those other ORMs can do, but it comes with a ton of nice-to-have features that really make it a standout choice. One of the great features of Prisma is that it is database agnostic. So if you're using the Sequelize library, you have to use an SQL database. If you're using the Mongoose library, you have to use the MongoDB database. And if you decide you want to switch from MongoDB to Postgres, you have to rewrite most of your application since the two libraries are so different. With Prisma, we don't have to do that. Prisma supports every major database out there. It currently has support for MySQL, Postgres, and MongoDB, and they're working on adding support for others like Elasticsearch and Cassandra. That means we can easily pick the database we want or switch between databases without needing to change any code. Well, you have to change some code. It's about 6 lines. These 6 lines we set up to connect to the particular database. Now, all of this works because Prisma wraps our database up and exposes it as a GraphQL API. So it exposes a GraphQL API that can be used to read and write from the actual database, regardless of what database we're using, whether we're using SQL, NoSQL, or whatever. Now that means our Node.js backend can read and write from the database using, you guessed it, GraphQL. So Prisma sits right here between our backend and the database. And you'll notice at this point, anytime we have communication between different layers, it's GraphQL. If the client wants to communicate with Node.js, it's GraphQL. And if Node.js wants to communicate with the database, it's GraphQL as well. So if Node.js wants to read data from the database, it sends off a GraphQL query. If Node.js wants to write data to our database, it sends off a mutation. And if Node.js wants to watch the database for changes, you guessed it, it sets up a subscription. Because we're using GraphQL between the client and the server, and between the server and the database, the server itself actually becomes a whole lot less important. There's not as much to actually do there, which is a good thing. It allows us to reduce the amount of code and the complexity of that code. It really just serves as a thin layer between the client and the database. So it's almost like the client has direct access to the database, though the server is still very important for things like authentication and data authorization. So we still want to make sure that someone can only read data they should actually be able to read, and we want to make sure that someone can only write data they should be able to write after, of course, that data has been sanitized and validated. So it's not like Node no longer serves a purpose, it just serves less of a purpose. It's more of a thin layer of communication between the client and the database. So let's take a look at a real-world example. Imagine I had a client and I wanted to get all of the posts. I would generate my operation and I'd send it off to Node. What does Node do? Node does not write another operation to send to the Prisma GraphQL API. It just takes the same one and passes it through. Prisma gets the data, and then Node passes that data back to the client. So Node really does not do a whole lot. Now, if it came to a mutation, I would first make sure that they were authenticated and that the data was valid, but then once again, I'd still pass that operation from the client right off to Prisma to perform that write, and when the data came back, I would just send it back through. Now, I don't expect your mind to be blown yet. I'll be honest. When I first heard about Prisma, my mind was not blown. I almost considered not using it in this class. It wasn't until I actually got into the code and saw how Prisma worked and how it helped me reduce the amount of code I had to manage that I got really excited. So that's enough of this visualization. We're going to continue on to the next video and start setting Prisma up. If you learned nothing else in this video, it should just be this. Prisma is an ORM. It works with all databases, and it makes it really easy for us to expose access to the database to a client in a secure and efficient way. All right, I'll see you next time.